Okay.
James, we're all good to go.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's a delight to have you at this meeting of the Cutting Edge Issues in Development Thinking and Practice. We are live on Zoom inside the LSE and live streaming on YouTube. So we invite everyone on Zoom to keep their microphones off and their cameras off until the Q&A. I want to remind people watching on YouTube that you can ask questions through the chat, and we will read out your questions during the Q&A. We are really privileged today to have Dr. Agnes Kalibata to speak to us on paradigm shifts in food systems, and there couldn't be a more important topic at the present moment. We're coming out of COP26. We're experiencing a pandemic that has put into question many of the dimensions of our food production and food supply chains globally. And Dr. Kalibata is president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, where she's led efforts with public and private partners for inclusive and sustainable agricultural growth with a focus on smallholder farmers. And in 2019, the UN Secretary General appointed Dr. Kalibata as special envoy for the 2021 Food Systems Summit, which took place during this past September. And I know it's a very contentious meeting, Agnes. There may be questions. I know that Ian was also following that closely, and I hope we can discuss some of those debates. Dr. Kalibata was Rwanda's Minister of Agriculture and Animal Resources. And this is when I met her back in the noughties. And I don't know that she really remembers me. I met you at least once in Kigali. Some of our research team members also met with you. But it's quite extraordinary, the achievements that you presided over in revitalizing Rwanda's agricultural system and turning it from a food insecure to a food secure status, and really offering quite a lot of lessons to others around sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Kalibata has held several other leadership positions in government and academia. She sits on the Global Commission on Adaptation, the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, the Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum, and the Architecture for REDD Plus transactions, among many other appointments. She has a series of a long string of prizes, and I don't want to take up the whole session by reading them all out. So it's a great honor to have you here, Agnes, to be speaking to us about paradigm shifts in food systems. We have Dr. Ian Scoons as discussant tonight, and we couldn't have a more illustrious discussant. Dr. Scoons is co-director of the ESRC STEPS Center at Sussex and principal investigator of the ERC Advanced Grant Project on pastoralism, uncertainty, and resilience, lessons from the margins. For any of us in Britain, we know Dr. Scoons for a long time as one of the experts on agrarian change. Some of our own students are reading your work, Ian, on agrarian reform and other issues. He works on agrarian and environmental change, particularly in Africa. And he has a particular interest in the connections between science, policy, and the politics of sustainability. He has long-term research on land and agricultural livelihoods in Zimbabwe, and is a member of the editorial collective of the great Journal of Peasant Studies, as well as being on the editorial board of Ecology and Society. So Ian, it's really kind of you to join us from Sussex. And I should mention, Dr. Kalibata, I think you're speaking to us from Nairobi, is it? Yes. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Agnes, and we're really looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you for those introductory remarks. And let me just say that I love the idea of being on the same floor as Ian, because the very challenges you're talking about, the science-policy interface, sustainability of these food systems and agricultural systems in particular, are things that I just feel like I live with every day, trying to figure out the next thing, and any opportunity to have a conversation with people in the same field is really huge. So let me, first of all, start by thanking you all for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk to you. It's pretty late here in Nairobi, but I'm as excited as if it was very early in the morning, because again, any opportunity to help you and the community that is involved here understand what we've been doing in the food systems in the last 18 months, but also understand some of the challenges we see as we try to move forward, and some of the shifts that we must live through is something that gives me pleasure to talk to you about. So I'm going to share some slides, mostly because, again, the conversation, it's conversational, and I want to be able to make sure that where you can't hear me, at least you can see some of the things I'm talking about, if there is anything like that. So I'm going to share some of the slides that I have here. So I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, that's good.
Very good. So again, like I said that earlier, when I was asked to have a conversation with you all, I thought that the best thing to start, the best place to go was to talk about some of the shifts we are seeing in our food systems. I want to start, I already started by appreciating the opportunity to talk to you all, but I wanted to emphasize that the work we've been doing and the challenges we're living through, and the challenges of the conversations we had in the last 18 months really are the world trying to find an equitable environment, an equitable society, but also a functional society. They are anchored in human rights. The Food Systems Summit was really about addressing the fact that we are not coming through on SDGs. So I know this did come out in a number of places where people were like, no, we are not addressing human rights. But actually, the whole conversation was about being able to come through on something we've committed to that we are not able to come through yet. The issue of human rights, the issue of SDGs, but also the issue of coming through on our planet in addition to coming through for people. And I'm going to take you through some of these. So in 2019, the Secretary General reached out and asked if we could move forward a food systems summit. And the food systems summit he was really mostly interested in the transformation of the food system. And he thought that for the food system to transform, it would have to be anchored around people, reaching out to people and engaging people, but it would also have to be anchored in science and how science is used to inform policies and investments subsequently at country level. So part of what I'm going to talk to you about is really show you the journey that we took when we approached this food system summit. We did it at a time of COVID, which was an extremely, in fact, 2 months after I was announced as special envoy, we had shutdown of travel and all those things happened, as you all know. And we just had to work through this through COVID. But I also must say that COVID did give us some wind in our sails, in the sense that the levels of anxiety among people and what we could do together increased. So we did move forward, partly due to the fact that the people saw an opportunity to move forward together. We did have this whole work anchored in science, as I said before, because for the first time, being the sixth meeting on food, this was the first one that was on food systems, but this is the first one that had a scientific group to look at the science and the evidence behind food systems and what is happening around food systems. So we had a group of scientists, which we call the scientific group, that really was a huge anchor, and I'll talk more about it. The food system, for me, coming to the leadership of the Food System Summit was for me an opportunity to call out what is going wrong with the African continent and the type of shifts that are needed on the African continent. I have a full-time job, but I took on the job because, again, of the kind of challenges that I saw, that working on the continent and beginning to see the opportunities for recovery that I was beginning to see, and then just seeing that taken away by climate change and by COVID after that, for me was a challenge I couldn't refuse to take on, if only to help the world understand where the continent is at, where the African continent is at with regards to these challenges. The Food System Summit, of course, is also an opportunity for us to rethink our nutrition. Right now, is it every 1 in 2 people on this continent? I mean, in our globe, is actually suffering with the challenge of improper food or inappropriate food, if I might call it that, leading to what now we call diet-related diseases. And just putting nutrition at the center of the food system seemed like a very important thing. But food is also an opportunity for us to connect from a humanity perspective. So we really did anchor it around that. It's an opportunity to improve livelihoods. And it's an opportunity now we know, and I'll talk more about that, to strengthen environmental sustainability. We do have challenges, of course. Many people want to refer to food systems as broken. I don't refer to them as broken because they still feed us. They still feed us, and in the last 50 years, food systems we are producing probably so much more food than we were able to produce before we figured out how to produce food the way we are today. So it has huge benefits. It's a huge industry. There's a huge industry that has been built around food systems. So it's really feeding us and keeping us going and keeping economies going. But it has challenges. There are huge parts of the world that are still living through hunger and malnutrition. And in fact, this year alone, we see 811 million people living in hunger. Malnutrition, for example, in Africa has gone up by 46% in the last 10 years. We see, like I said earlier, diet-related diseases. We see that now we know that food systems are contributing 30% to greenhouse gases, some of that coming from food loss and waste, which is $1 trillion, it costs us $1 trillion annually. We see challenges that are related to trade and inability to, now we talk about short versus long supply chains and some of the disruption that we are living through that we need to think through and their contribution to part of the climate change. We see food-related conflicts, but these are all related to some of the other challenges, climate change especially. But also we see a whole lot of biodiversity loss and land degradation that is associated with food systems. So yes, food does a whole lot. It keeps us together. It brings us together as societies. It's our culture, but it also has impact on our environment in ways that we need to start thinking about. And that's the reason I was talking about the type of paradigm shifts we need to think through. If we are going to come through for people, not just for people, but for our planet as well, and for our economies. So I'm not going to repeat this, but because I said them already, but maybe here I call out, what I haven't called out before is the challenge of resilience and adaptation that we need to be investing in. And the reason I'm calling this out is during COP26, one of the things that became stuck to me as clarity, huge clarity for me is the fact that even if we manage to get hold of climate change today and manage to stop climate from changing any further, what is already happening in our midst is going to go on for the next 30 to 40 years, meaning that for communities that are already experiencing challenges, really significant investments in resilience and adaptation is something that we are going to have to do to make sure that these communities survive. And most of these communities are found either around the equator or in small island states around the world, and in some other vulnerable places that are susceptible to rising sea levels. So when we come when you look at the food system, then we really, and trying to approach how the food system works, we really try to look at it from a holistic approach. And the scientists in our midst that we've been working with have described it as that process really that comes all the way from production to how we consume food at our tables, but also how we dispose of it, the number of institutions that are involved and the types of things we do, the stakeholders and the governments and member states and intergovernmental processes that are involved in the process and the collaboration of food. So there's the whole food system really became so complex. Even my own understanding as we started this work became so complex. So what we did then was really to focus on two things. We focused on ability to reach people and mobilize as many people as we can, and ability to mobilize solutions. So really the food system was designed, the food system summit was designed around those two areas. In mobilizing people, we put in place dialogues. So we thought that the best way to ensure that we get most from people is we initiate dialogues. So member states had dialogues going on in their own countries to identify what is broken or what is working and what's not working. Then we realized that outside member states, we have all sorts of communities. So we had what we call independent dialogues as well. In those independent dialogues, people also had conversations, and we tried to make sure that producers are talking to each other, that indigenous people are having conversations, that youth are having conversations, that private sector is having conversations, and where the opportunity presented itself, that civil society is talking, and that really we are all talking to each other at the same time. And these dialogues, I'll tell you in a minute how much they've really helped us achieve and how much we've been able to do. We put in place a champions network that was whose really purpose was for people who cared about the food systems enough to mobilize networks that would also ensure that people that I don't have access to or the food system some doesn't have access to still get an opportunity about those food systems. We mobilize people across all constituencies, again, across producers, fishers, across all groups of people. Then we had the scientific group working behind the scenes, making sure that we put forward the science of the summit. And then we mobilize action through 5 areas we call action tracks. And mobilizing action is actually what we call mobilizing solutions. We had over 2,500 solutions mobilized, and this we call them game-changing ideas. We consolidated them into 55 solution clusters, and of course they sit across the 5 action areas. So through these dialogues, through this constituency mobilization, we reached millions of people. And through this solution, through action tracks, we mobilized millions of institutions, but also individuals in terms of whoever had ideas that could be transformative. And these ideas were discussed by institutions, and to be able to land here as ideas that were considered game-changing ideas, they went through several iterations where people really gave them significant thought. Fast forward, the Food System Summit did happen on the 23rd of September, and it really, really, again, like I said earlier on, we were able to see huge mobilization coming from member states. We had over 165 member states provide member state statements. We had 148 countries participating, and they're still doing so, participate in dialogues around how to change their food systems. Of those, 107 already submitted their national pathways, what you would call national strategies of changing food systems, on how they would change food systems, were submitted by the date of the 23rd. We have over independent dialogue still going on. Our target is to reach 1,000, and I think we are reaching them before end of this month. We have commitments. So we put in place a commitment registry and encouraged communities, everybody who wants to make a commitment. And we have 227 commitments, and commitments range from something as some NGO in Nepal committing to do something to a huge coalition, global coalition, like a school feeding coalition, where you have like 35 member states and more that are coming together to do something. We involved research and development agencies. We involved technology institutions and institutions that look at innovations. We looked at the interface between science and policy and how this should inform policy reforms. And we looked at how we'd implement all this, really look, especially talking about the financial instruments that would be appropriate to drive a food systems change. To just give you a sense of what came out of these conversations, especially the member states, we did an analysis to try to understand what member states were putting forward, because the Secretary General asked for commitments. So what were they committing to? What are they willing to do? So this is what they said in their statements. But this is also an expression of their priorities and concerns. So 81 member states, the two things that came out forward the most, and they scored it, interestingly, they scored the same marks or same number of member states: recovery from COVID and collaboration. So the Food System Summit did really bring out in people the whole idea of collaboration and recognizing that no single institution can do this alone or come through these things alone. So member states were calling for collaboration to get the food systems work going, but they were also calling for an end and mechanisms of supporting recovery from COVID-19. Of course, a number of other areas were called out: the whole perspective of ending hunger, the whole perspective of improving diets. And then, interestingly, from where you're sitting, I also noticed that when you add them up, about 69 institutions called out for science and technology and innovation and research, and really just ensuring that what we do is informed by science. And I can share these slides if you're interested. We did get significant contribution from the area of the academia, and the academia did basically did really, through the work of the scientific group, did confirm some of these findings. And this is compiled in a lot of work that was done in what we are calling the science reader. The science reader and the scientific group brought out 7 priorities that if invested in, would actually enhance an end to hunger and improve our results on the environment. And there are quite a number of other products that came from those pieces of work. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that some of the conversations that we didn't have also get heard, right? There are some things that we didn't bring out enough. I don't think that we're able to address the question of staying within planetary boundaries enough because some of the challenges of the summit. I don't think we're able to address the question and the challenge of the true cost of food enough because, again, the true cost of food is through the resources we spend on health and the resources we spend on correcting challenges on the environment. And then, of course, we also didn't explore enough the opportunities for investing in businesses that are green, even though that is going to have to be the future. And when I say this, I mean, when we talk about COP26, we are trying to think about new business models because of where we are at. The agricultural system is going to have to come up with new business models because of where we are at. And the food system is going to come up with new business models because of where we are at. Now, fast forward, when I look at all that, maybe I just, as well of concluding this conversation, I wanted to go to some of the work that that I was able to do in Rwanda, and just help you how some of these things can translate into real results on the ground. And I know that Ian will bring some of this up, and I would love to hear how he brings it up. But the Rwandan story is something that I always find interesting, in the sense that, you know, here you have a very small country that has a responsibility to feed itself and be able to make smallholder farmers viable. But they're the smallest in the world. They're the smallest, basically, smallest smallholder farmers, you might say. So how do you create the right balance between making a farmer, a smallholder farmer viable, and ensuring that they do what they are doing in a sustainable environment? So some of the things we put in place in Rwanda included things like consolidation of land, so that in the process you consolidate farmers and move from a farmer carrying their surplus in a small basket on their head to actually collectively that surplus being something that a truck can come and pick, create markets, help them create markets. We did do what we called intensification, where we helped them access improved seeds and fertilizers so that they could have increased productivity. And then we also focused a lot on land restoration, because a lot of Rwanda's land was lost to degradation because of overuse. People use land, it loses value, or it loses, soil erosion happens, and they leave it and they go to the next bit. So here, this is a place where really trying to understand what scientific approaches we can put in place and how you turn them into policy to help you move things forward was what had it work for Rwanda. It's been successful, and it's been controversial in some places, but I would say I really think that at least Rwanda can very proudly talk about being able to be a food secure country within limits, given the challenges of food security that we have on the continent in general. And then, of course, Rwanda is a very bold when it comes to doing things that are right from a climate change perspective or policy perspective. We've taken very bold measures on climate change. But this is mostly because we have a small space. We need to do the right things. So some of the policies are informed by the needs on the ground. We've also looked at opportunities to build partnerships where we could, so that we can enhance public-private partnerships that can be transformative in nature. So, for example, there's a partnership with some of the businesses that have actually led to transformative food solutions, and we can talk about that if you're interested. But also, Rwanda has invested a lot in harnessing technology and digitization. So, all these this is all, when you look at it, really, all the way from food systems to what is happening in Rwanda, the need to think differently, the need to find solutions to deal with the challenges we are working with today is something that we have to build in what we are doing. And in fact, one of the conclusions of the Food Systems Summit is that the means of implementation, in addition to being financing, there are two other things we must put in place in terms of ensuring that we implement food systems. We must govern right, meaning that we engage all sectors, but we also engage all people, and we must be prepared to use innovation to continue innovating. And you see it here. So this takes me to then talking to you a little bit about the work that we do in AGRA. Really, if you look at the Rwandan perspective as one way of doing business and one extreme, in AGRA, what we're trying to do is just trying to understand that to have a sustainable perspective on the African continent, we need functional systems and we need functional institutions that can be able to deliver sustainably. Because fixing the challenges of hunger is not extremely complicated. The formula is already known. You have the right seeds, you have the maybe inputs, other inputs like fertilizers where you need them, you use them right, you have the right level of extension, you get enough yields, even in one season. Can you sustain it from a market's perspective? Can you sustain it from a farmer's doing it perspective if they see, because it costs money to do all those things? Can you sustain it from an environmental perspective? So these things to be able to be sustainable need the right policy environment They need the right systems to function. They need they need the right capacities at country level. So that's really where we invest a lot of our energy. And we've built partnerships with some of our donors, so to also help them understand some of the challenges we go through. So we have a partnership for agricultural transformation that has a number of partners. And here, the key focus for this particular partnership in AGRA is also to address the challenge of donor fragmentation and aid fragmentation. Because you find here in Africa, like there's so many programs that end up not adding up. And as a result, you see that aid doesn't add up. You see that transformation doesn't come despite the investments. So having done a whole lot of analysis of these things, we thought that if we can encourage people to come together, first of all, it gives them visibility of where each other is investing, which they usually don't have. What is the visibility of where you're investing, who you're investing in, who you're working with, and can we build on those efforts rather than, and do the gaps rather than do the same things, all of us. So these are some of the challenges we are addressing at AGRA, all of it with the intention of ensuring that at the end of the line, we do have transforming farmers, we do build systems that can ensure that private sector, especially SMEs here in Africa, are able to take advantage of the environment, working environment, private sector environment, because policies are being reformed, because business opportunities are being created, so that they can sustain the system of agricultural transformation. So we really focused on ensuring that these things work. And if they work, we see farmers transforming, but there will always be a long time between systems working and capacities being built and farmers being able to transform. So that's really the focus of our work as AGRA. And I just wanted to take this to conclusion by insisting on the fact that as an academic, as people that are in academia, that as the people I'm talking to here, I would really like to emphasize the science to policy interface and the need to make this work faster. So the other day I was talking to a scientific group and I was saying, is it possible to actually be very deliberate around having conversations at country level on the science policy interface so that we don't spend so much time having technology sitting on the table, on the shelf, and the policy is taking forever to catch up with technological development, because now we are able to develop technologies faster than we did a few years ago. But policies are not able to keep pace, especially here in Africa. Part of what my institution does is to reform, to support countries to reform policies. We've moved from about 10 years of policies being reformed to about 3 years. 3 years is still a lot of time to reform a policy for something you know is a solution to a problem you're trying to fix. The other point I would like to make is that the food systems that we advanced in the Food Systems Summit really has to be the way to go, because feeding people, driving for the bottom, for a very, very affordable food prices, which is what we do from a business perspective, is not where the world is at. We are going to have to care about our planet. We are going to have to care about how some of the challenges that come after impact our economies and how much that takes us backwards. So I think now a functional food system would have to be a food system that takes care of people, that takes care of planet, but also answers the challenges that we are dealing with in our economies, especially the challenge of inequity. Today, there are so many people that earn less than is sufficient to buy a decent meal. And yet we call that poverty line. We have that as the poverty line. How can our ability to graduate from the poverty line not be able to afford a decent meal? Those are some, again, I'm talking about paradigm shifts here. We have an opportunity to build on the momentum generated in COP26 to transform food systems, but the conversation in COP26 has to embed a lot more the food system, because the food system is contributing to climate change. We now know that. But the food system suffers the most from climate change. And so the ability to have adaptation as a mechanism of addressing the challenges the food system is facing. And this is important because it affects the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable people. So that's why adaptation is an important part of what we need to be talking about. The biggest opportunity in our midst around the world, I guess, is the young people of this world. They pushed us very hard in the Food Systems Summit. They wanted to see change. They pushed very hard for appropriate. The number one thing they put forward a declaration in the Food Systems Summit. The number one thing they were calling for is healthy food, healthy diets. It's costing us so much money to stay on top of health, and this is something that can be fixed from a food perspective. They also care about where our planet is going, and they are telling us that we are running the planet to the ground and we are leaving them nothing. So definitely, they have their heart and ambition in the right places. So let's really give them the opportunity to be better leaders than we have been when it comes to leading for the environment, but also to really be better leaders than we have been when it comes to ensuring that we have a healthy population. Right now, like I said earlier, our population is heavily burdened from a health perspective. So there are so many things, but I think here for me, the biggest thing is the changes in our food systems are real. I gave you an example, a counter example from Rwanda perspective. I gave you a continental example from an African perspective, but I also talked to you about the food systems and the things we are focused on and how we thought we might shift the paradigm. All in all, if you ask me, what did we achieve in the Food Systems Summit? I'll say for me, the thing that I'm most proud of is being able to shift the paradigm around how we think about food. There's no question that around the world, people now think about food as a system that they see that impacts a number of other things besides just a good meal to have. So that's number one. Number two, there are now a huge number of member states that are busy thinking through how to build sustainable food systems. And yes, it will take a long time for all of us to come through on building food systems, but at least we are thinking about the shifts that must happen. Number three, there are partnerships that are being built to ensure that we come through together, where we see the biggest opportunity to come through together, whether it's when you look at things like coalitions on agroecology, coalitions on sustainable livestock, coalitions on school feeding. These are all things that are major global things that we aspire to, or we feel we should achieve, but no single institution, no single country can do it alone. And just seeing the world come together around these things is something that gives me great pleasure in terms of what we've achieved. And then the science, we now have a science behind all the stuff that we've done that speaks about what is important to food systems and how food systems can start being incorporated in how we advance our world, including the numbers that are needed to deal with these challenges. More important from a science and policy perspective, we have this community now together through the work of the scientific group. We have over 25 institutions of science and policy with their networks that are linking up to the HLPs, the high-level panel of experts that support the CFS, whether they agree or disagree. At least now they have visibility of each other. And once they agree to work together, I think the world will be a much, much better place. So I'll conclude there. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. And I hope I have been able to paint for you a picture of the type of shifts that our food systems need to be able to move us forward. Thank you again, James.
Agnes, thank you. As clear, as sharp as ever, even at the late hour, it is where you are. And so we'll now ask Ian to give us a comment and then ask you if you would like to respond before we'll pass on to the Q&A. And I remind everybody they can start to type their questions in the chat and also send questions through the messaging on YouTube. So Ian, can I turn the screen over to you?
Thank you, James, and thank you, Agnes, for such a fantastically comprehensive overview. There's a lot we agree on in what you've said. The importance, I mean, the clear central importance of food, central to our common challenges, and particularly, I think, this linkage between food and wider questions of sustainability and climate and so on, and the need to think about food and food systems in a holistic way, and that we have to have dialogues around this. And I think all of those things are absolutely central. But I want to, in the interest of having a bit of a discussion, make a few points around three different themes. I want to talk about systems and how we think about systems. I want to talk about green revolutions and how we think about green revolutions. And I want to think about, well, what does that mean about paradigm shifts, and whether what you've proposed is a new paradigm, or whether we have to think a bit more deeply about what those paradigms should be. So, systems. I mean, I think has been a really important move to shift the food debate to a systems debate. But I think there's been a tendency in a lot of the discussion over the last 18 months and beyond to have a quite technocratic view of what systems are. Systems are about science, about technology, about markets. But in the centre I work with at Sussex, we talk a lot about systems, complex systems, not just as the material, technical market arrangements, but as about social and political relations. And I think we have to, you hinted at it, we have to think about the social and political relations that underpin what food systems are. And the other thing to think about systems and food systems in particular is that they're plural. There isn't just one food system. There are multiple food systems, and it depends where you sit, what a system looks like. So, there are dominant, powerful food systems, and there are alternative ones, and different actors associated with different political and social relations will have very different views on whether those are good, bad, indifferent, or whatever. So I think that's what we would say from our perspective at the STEP Centre, to think about systems in that way. And that raises, of course, very fundamental, central questions of political economy. The basic questions of who owns what, who controls what, who benefits, who loses out, and the broader effects, structural effects of food systems on environments, both now and in the future. So I think, bringing questions of power and politics, as well as equity, which you did mention, into this debate about food systems, plural food systems, is central. Because as I said, food systems are not the same. A long value chain, high tech, high reliance on fossil fuel food system is totally different to one rooted in local economies, less reliant on external inputs, more circular, more sustainable, obviously. But we have to have that debate and about what the political, economic, and other trade-offs are. And as I said, I think the way you see a system depends on who you are. It's about the material conditions of production, the labor relations, gender relations that constitute them, that matter. And we have to understand food systems in that light, I would say. So I think, defining what systems are, and food systems in particular, how they're constructed by people through values, ethics, cultures, always imbued with politics. And you've overseen the UN Food Systems Summit. There's a lot of politics in this debate, but I think we have to surface it and have a discussion about it. Systems aren't objectively defined out there by science. They're always contested. And I think that relates to the wider question about green revolutions. I think going beyond what's often quite a narrow technical discussion of systems and science and market fixes around them for the future of agriculture is really essential. We need to think about how different farmers, workers, consumers, traders, and others think about agricultural transformation or green green revolutions. There isn't a single pathway. There's not one green revolution. They're always negotiated. And that's the important point, I think, about the relationship between science and policy. It's not that science comes up with the solutions, it gets implemented in policy, and then we have an agricultural transformation. It's not the relation from science to policy. It's about the negotiation between the two, as you well know, having been a minister. So it's how those negotiations happen, in what political context, with whom, that then becomes important. But we often get trapped in this rather technical vision of green revolutions, which often has been invented after the event, just about high yielding varieties and fertilizers and inputs. And everyone knows that the transformations of agriculture in India, in China, and indeed in Rwanda was much more than those technical components. It was much more about, it was also about institutions and policies and that negotiated politics. And that's why I've been a bit disappointed in the way some of this was debated, for example, at the COP. So there was a big meeting where the CGIAR, the International Network of Agricultural Research Institutes across the globe, which I have huge respect for, launched with British aid money in particular, what they called, let me try and remember it, a climate shot towards sustainable agriculture, framed as an innovation race. Now, it just struck me. I mean, I know it's appealing to the donors. I know it sounds good, but this framing as, climate shot, moonshot, technical only, innovation race, I thought it just missed the point. Have they learned nothing from green revolutions past? The CG, of course, was born out of the original green revolutions. So I found that disappointing, because on the panel that discussed it, there was not one mention of the social and political in that debate. And I think very often we get trapped in the idea that science can always deliver. I have to say, I had a look at the website, AGRA's website earlier, and your corporate profile for this year. I'm sorry to give it back to you. I mean, in a corporate, you can look at my institution, the corporate profile says something probably that I have no idea what's on it. But anyway, for the benefit of your information as president, we believe that access to improved technology such as seed, fertilizer, market infrastructure, innovative finance will lead to large-scale adoption, driving systemic change that will result in improved farmer livelihoods. I agree. But then there's something more than that. I mean, you said in your talk, the formula is well known. I would say the formula is not that well known, because actually you went on to say that actually its policy systems, institutions, and so on, and I would add political negotiations between different actors in the food system that are important to delivering it. So I think that's why I would want to challenge and push back a little bit about some of this sort of very optimistic view, innovation race, and so on, that we get trapped in sometimes. It's what my colleague Robert Chambers, who now retired, but very influential in these debates over many, many years, called a transfer of technology approach, top-down, linear, technocratic. And I think sometimes we get captured in the zeal often of enthusiastic philanthropists, I could name a few, who feel that the only solution is down that route. And I think we have to push back from that, even if they, like Bill Gates, provide quite a lot of money to all of this. So to some extent, I found bits of the UN Food Summit. I didn't follow it all, I have to say. I was involved in a few of those thousands of sessions that you mentioned. A little bit disappointing. I think anchoring in science, as you said, is really good. I mean, my background as a biologist originally. We also have to think about anchoring in people. I mean, I don't think you'll disagree with that. And I think we have to think about how to anchor that more broadly in a wider politics, because there's a real danger, as was the critique of the UN Food Systems Summit, which I think was legitimate to some degree, that they can be captured by corporate interests and through a narrow multi-stakeholder approach, if we don't, as it were, surface the political interests that are at the center of it. And I was in Glasgow for a bit, and I found the COP quite depressing in that sense, because the wider political mobilizations were happening on the streets outside, but not in the conference rooms. This was, there was a lot of talk about climate and market fixes, technological fixes, and so on. And I think that tends to get replicated in the food debate, and I think that's a missed opportunity. So to conclude, what does this all say to new paradigms? I'm not against technology, I'm not against markets, I'm not against the involvement of business, but we have to ask to what ends and under whose control. And I think this is the crucial debate that's missed in a lot of the food systems debate and a lot of our debates about development, frankly, more broadly. We have to understand how systems are constructed politically and socially, and we have to understand how different farmers' conditions affect that. And you know that. I mean, you started out as a breeder. The most effective forms of development of new seeds happens in participation with farmers, in dialogue. It's not just the breeder produces the seed and gives it to the farmer. It's always a dialogue and it's always an interaction. And we need to think about science in that way much more than we probably do. So it's not the silver bullet seed that will be captured by a big corporation and sold as with proprietary rights. I mean, a lot of the GM crop advocates fell into that trap, I think. We have to go beyond that to think about different food systems, different farming systems that have farmers and people at the center. So to summarize, and I've gone over time, I'm sure, I haven't got my clock on. Let's go beyond this technical market fix that we get trapped in because it sounds flashy, to have a wider understanding of what complex social and political systems of food, climate, and their interactions are. Let's have farmers and consumers and laborers and traders, both first and last, a much more fully participatory approach, which is genuinely a dialogue, not just a construction of multi-stakeholder positions. And let's recognize in that necessarily, inevitably, politics are central. Who controls the food system, inevitably, and the science that underpins it is crucial, because not all food systems are the same. I'll finish there.
Ian, thank you very much. And you were actually quite close to time, only a minute or two more. So really succinct with a very important contribution. Agnes, would you like to make an initial response while our audience gathers together their questions?
No, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, James. I mean, I really want to say I agree largely to all the points you're making, Ian, around food systems is much more than technologies, and we need to bring in the social political dimension. The political economy is real. And I think one of the challenges, as you talk, I keep asking myself, so how did we fail to communicate that? Because let me give you an example. From a food system perspective, this whole thing was built around member states, recognizing fully well that the politics and the policy has to be at the table. In fact, part of the reason I was saying that we didn't get to some of the difficult conversations is because some member states drew a line. And it's like, this is a no-go area. So much as you think that this is a necessary shift, but we didn't have those conversations because the line was drawn very early in the conversation. Again, underscoring the place and role of politics and interests and political economy in many of these things that you're saying. So I just want to recognize it's true. I'm not going to argue with the points you're making, but I want to ask a different question of my own. Listening to you, the thing that I keep asking myself, because what you're saying is true. And coming from Rwanda, in fact, if there's one thing I learned coming out of Rwanda, was that technology is not the fix, right? No, actually, that's the reason I said it's easy to change a farmer, right? We know the formula, like I said, the formula of getting the amount of yield you want, but it's not easy to change the sector, right? Because changing the sector involves this, not just the science, not just the policies, but the political economy as well, and the political direction that is needed to do that, and of course the investments. So listening to all that, so what I did coming from Rwanda, coming to AGRA, we put a lot of emphasis, even as that statement that you said is true. What doesn't come out is the investments we make in policy to ensure that policies move, is the investment we make in political economy, in understanding governments and how they work, in trying to help them make, really sit around the table and have discussions around what to prioritize versus what and why. So we do have those conversations. In fact, since I came to AGRA, we built AGRA as an African institution, not because I think that I have anything against any other continent, but because having come from a ministry, I understand how important it is for someone to trust the person they are talking to, for someone to know that I have no additional interest in trying to advise you except seeing the continent move forward. Because I know that that's a real problem that these ministers have. Sometimes they are just not as well versed with these issues as they should be. And every time you're making a suggestion, they don't know in whose interest you're making it. So we said, you know what, we need to build an African institution that helps these people understand that your interest is as much as my interest, or my interest is as much as your interest. And we help you figure out the conversations out there. We help you translate it, but let's not use the excuse of not knowing who to trust to not move forward. So I do understand the challenges you're talking about, but the question that I wanted to drive to, how is it that the rest of the world, and maybe the rest of the world is such a big word, how is it that most people don't understand, or the science policy interface is not coming up enough? I mean, we tried several things from a technology perspective. We talked about technology transfers. And one time it was the buzz thing, it was the buzz. Everybody wanted to figure out how to transfer technology. We've moved that. We are talking about, just like the statement you just read from an AGRA perspective, technology is still at the center. How come we are not? And yet we know, let me just give you an example, and yet we know that China's transformation in the last 40 years was not because of technology. It was through institutional innovations as a result of understanding their science policy interface and really moving it down to institutional innovations. How come that's not becoming the way we do business? Where is that voice? Let me even ask, why weren't you engaged enough in the food system summit to challenge that technology perspective and bring out more the political economy and the policy perspective? So how do we get to do that, more of that?
This is always good when the speaker throws back a question.
I know. Sorry.
No, but it's Ian, I think I'll go first to some of the questions from the audience, and then you can come back to this as well. Okay? Yeah. So we have two that I want to start with. And so first is from one of our MRes students here in the school from India, Shinzani Jain, who I'll ask to ask her own question. And then I have a question from Peter Goebbels, who is asking a question through YouTube, and I'll read that out. And we also have one from Dwika Burgess Watson from YouTube. So we'll go with these three first. So Shinzani.
Good evening, ma'am, and thank you so much for your very articulate presentation. My research is on land in India, and I wanted to ask how do you place the question of land and the increasing corporatization of land around the world, and also Malays in South Africa, and how do you associate that entire question with the question of food systems?
Shinzani, did you say the increasing corporatization?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, and then we have a question from Dwika Burgess. I'm sorry if I'm perhaps not pronouncing the name correctly. Where do we situate the question of, okay, that's Shinzani. I'm sorry. Do I have, oh yeah. From Newcastle University, corporate control of the food system is the elephant in the room for meaningful reform. Who is the private sector in these partnerships? That's the question. And we have from Peter Goebbels from Groundswell International, who's the Director of Action, Research and Advocacy there, based in West Africa. Dr. Kalibata, in terms of a change to paradigm, the HPLE and also the FAO have strongly proposed agroecology as the pathway. To what extent do you consider it as important and also worthy of research? So I wonder if we want to start with those three.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. I will just call out the questions because in some cases I was not able to write the names, but I think Jane asked a question on land around increasing corporatization of land, especially in some places, and called out South Africa in particular. I think the whole idea of corporatization of land from an agricultural perspective draws from some perceived, and again, maybe and here you might have some more information, but some myth that with corporatization, you're able to drive better productivity and probably better bottom lines, which will allow also for, better bottom lines for the consumer, which then allows for better businesses. And I think there's sufficient evidence that small farmers, not as small as in Rwanda necessarily, but small farmers can actually drive as good productivity and sometimes even better productivity. So again, this is part of where countries, what Ian was talking about around how production systems and how food production in general is looked at from a political perspective, where people look at this as a mode of what you would call your self-sufficiency in food. Get a few people that you think can do it well, get a few businesses can drive the right perspective from a food perspective, rather than have governments worry about, it's working with farmers needs government to be really engaged. So in some cases, I feel like governments don't want to engage the right way, and it makes more sense for them to pass the buck on to businesses that then engage on their behalf. Is that necessarily right? From a perspective of farmers and even driving the right behavior from an environmental perspective, I think this model is being put to question. That's why from a food system perspective, the whole idea of repurposing public subsidies to move them from this type of production system to more user-friendly productive systems that are work for environment is going to be the way to go. The Food System Summit recommended that some of these things be looked at so that we can reduce the drive for big engagement, big business engagement into this type of acquiring more land and basically industrial agriculture. We need to step back a little bit and ask ourselves around the impact of agricultural systems to climate. And again, this comes from some of these big business level agriculture. So again, the question is, we need to rethink our models. And I don't necessarily think that this is going to be the way we rethink our models. So every model has its challenges. The biggest challenge of this model is its impact on the environment. And I think there are opportunities for this to be rethought. I think there are opportunities to ensure there's better equity coming out of ensuring that people that produce are stronger rather than get them out of land. But again, there are all sorts of political economies here that vary from country to country and are going to be influenced by what countries are trying to achieve. And at the end of the day, we have to come back to the whole idea of working as a community from a food system perspective and a global from a food system perspective. But those challenges will not go away in one day. So corporate control probably speaks to the same thing as when we say corporate control is the elephant in the room. It's true that, in many developed countries, how many people are in farming? 5%, 3%, 2%? because the farming is done from a corporate perspective. So this is the way the business has been designed from an agricultural perspective. So there's so much power that has been invested in those models. And there's so much resources that have been invested in those models. So it's true, and moving away from that is not going to happen in one day. But what we are trying to do in the food system is to try to build trust, to try to at least create a mechanism that allows corporates to start thinking about the type of models they need to shift. Because we can't shift about dysfunctional coal models, even though coal produces the most cheap and affordable energy, and fail to talk about some of the dysfunctional agricultural models that we are in, just because we don't want to shift. But doesn't want to shift doesn't mean that it's not impacting people and environment. So here, the beginning of the shift could be around what conversations we are having and how willing we are and comfortable we are to have conversations together. That's why we kept saying that the best way to engage is not to shut corporates out, is actually to ask them to be on the table and challenge them, be able to have conversations that allow us to challenge them. So they're going to be the elephant in the room for some time until we have those conversations and demand the necessary changes that we need to see where we should see them. The conversation around HLP and FAO's recommendations on agroecology, I have every reason to believe that this must be founded in work that they've done. And where we are going, there's an opportunity to really look at the promise that agroecology might hold. So even us here, where we are in Africa, here we are trying to look at how what type of meaning that would have for different countries that we work in. We are definitely going to have to try to see if there's something there that we can build on, to see if there's something there that can help us ensure that farmers have good yields, and ensure that we are restoring the environment. What we can't afford is to do business as usual, because it's not definitely working for our environment. So yes, you want to do research in this, by all means. I think this would be something that would be a huge contribution to new thinking around where food systems are going.
Thank you, Agnes. Ian, do you want to come in here?
Happily so. Thank you, James. Thank you, Agnes. I mean, two of the questioners have raised this whole question about who controls the food system and who controls the means of production of food. So, questions of access and control over land, questions of corporate control in the food system. I think these are absolutely central questions that should be front and center of any of our debates about the future of food systems. And I think you're right that they aren't as central as they need to be. But we know that there are particular sets of policy incentives, subsidies, and the rest that result in forms of consolidation, both of land and of businesses within food systems. And we have to ask very hard and searching questions of whether these are producing the type of food, both the type of food and the distribution of food, and the equitable balance to food systems that we want, that will deliver sustainable food systems. And I think the very simple answer is that they aren't. We've had an immense concentration of both land and corporate control of food systems over the last 20 or 30 years, which has produced a lot of cheap food, but it hasn't necessarily produced nutritious food. It hasn't necessarily produced food in the right places, and it hasn't necessarily produced food that is sustainable and compatible with the environment. I work a lot on livestock, and this is, a classic case whereby, you have a massive concentration of the meat and milk sector globally. Yet at the same time, we have a whole range of extensive livestock producers, pastoralists, open grazing systems, which are producing meat and milk in a highly sustainable way, often compatible with the climate, whereas the the corporate form of milk production is simply not. So, we need a debate about that. But, again, I saw in the COP a lack of nuance in this discussion. And this came from multiple sides. It came from the meat industry, who wanted to protect its business base, who said, yeah, we can deal with the methane pledge. All we need is a bit of technology. We'll add it to the feed of the cows, and they will produce less methane. It's a technical fix solution, yet again. And on the other side, we had others arguing that the only solution of this is to remove meat production completely, with all sorts of consequences, not necessarily in the rich Western North where I live, but for poorer people around the world. But these are basic questions about who wins and who loses about food system trajectories. There are different food systems. In this case, sustainable, extensive meat production, what Peter might call agroecology, and an industrial form and there are choices out there, and we're going to have to make them, and they're political choices where there are big vested interests that will prevent shifts happening. On the question of agroecology, I agree, Peter, that this is an absolutely central area where investment in research in complex systems that look at how production and environment go together. But there's been a bit of a trend in agroecology just to think of agroecology just as another technology. We don't want GM crops, we want agroecology. Well, that's not the way to think about it. Agroecology, as I understand it, is about understanding complex systems. It's about the politics, about the social basis of production, and it's about the technologies all together. And I think we need to think about that, much as I said, in a rather more open way about systems. James, am I allowed to answer Agnes's question about the science policy interface, or we'll come back to that?
Yes, go ahead, but fairly briefly.
Very briefly.
Yeah.
Okay, I think the critical word in science policy interface is interface. We often think that, this is about getting a bunch of scientists together, and Joachim and the group in the science panel group in the UNFSS had a lot of illustrious scientists there. But there was very much a sense of, we're the scientists, we know best, we have to then influence policy. But it's not the interface. And I think the interface is the key point. And actually, in the CFS, the Committee on Food Security, in the FAO, we do have an interface which doesn't necessarily get captured by the red lines of governments, because the CFS, the Committee on Food Security, is, for the first time ever in a multilateral process to think about a big issue, in this case, food security, is a platform that allows civil society in alongside governments. This is where the interface is. This is where the interface has to happen. The problem with the COP process, and to some extent the UN Food Systems Summit, the decisions then get dominated by the particular political interests of particular governments. And we saw that in the COP resolutions. And you end up with this lowest common denominator, or blocking from different sides. So a much more open debate is where the dialogue happens. And to create that, I think, for all its faults, and there are some, for sure, the CFS, the Committee on Food Security, under the FAO, which is a multilateral organization with multiple government members, but to open that up to a wider debate, does allow us to have a much more concrete and much more open discussion about the relationship between science and policy, and not accept science only just leads to policy in a linear way. Sorry, James.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And I mean, one of the things that impressed me so much about Rwanda was actually the science policy interface at a very difficult period of history coming out of into the late 1990s and early 2000s. And maybe Agnes would like to say something about that But I wanted to give the questions to our audience. And I'm going to first call on Bethany Plant, who's an IDHE student, master's student at the LSE. And then I have an anonymous question from YouTube, and then Lydia Cabral from YouTube, and I'll read both those out. But first, Bethany. Are you there?
Yeah. Yeah. So my question is mainly, I guess, for Ian, which is this idea of, like, I completely agree that you need to work on this, like, science policy interface. But do you think there could be any kind of downside to taking that approach? Obviously, you were saying about, like, this kind of idea of just putting technologies in, and, like, the Bill Gates Foundation and other kind of big corporations. Like, say what you will about them, and they obviously have a lot of faults. They can get things done very quickly and things like that. And could maybe this kind of very complex, going from bottom up and middle out approach actually, like, create more delays in getting technologies in? And could that be a problem? Yeah, again, like, I'm just trying to figure out if there could be any challenges to this approach. I do actually agree with you, but yeah.
Thank you. This is a very good question. Now we have a question from YouTube. Agnes, could Dr. Kalibata develop on the public-private partnerships that led to transformative change in Rwanda? And then I have a second question from the YouTube audience from Lydia Cabral. Shortening food chains are seen as a way of building more equitable systems. Any evidence that governments are taking local markets more seriously? Could this be a route to decolonize African food systems? So why don't we run with those three? Sorry, Agnes, we're really making you work late at night.
It's okay. Maybe Ian will take the first one on science policy interface. Then I didn't hear the last one. I heard the second one, but I didn't hear the first one.
Okay.
I mean the last one.
Shall I repeat the last one?
Please,
So,
please.
yeah. So Lydia is asking or stating, shortening food chains are seen as a way of building more equitable systems. Is there any evidence that governments are taking local markets more seriously? Could this be a route to decolonize African food systems? Okay. Yeah. Ian,
Good. Yeah, maybe Ian could go with the first one, then I'll go with the second two.
Okay.
Okay, let's go with the first one. So Bethany says, you know, my argument makes everything far too complicated, and we'll never get anything done. Now, I mean, that's often a reaction to participation and to interactions with people. But if you don't do participation, then things unravel later. So you might get something done, but then the farmers may say, well, we don't want that technology, we want something else. So actually investing in that dialogue, investing in the participation in developing whether technologies or whether policies is really important. And, you know, we've learned time and time again that, you know, simple silver bullet solutions often don't hit the mark, and actually investing in the processes by which both technologies and policies are developed is essential. They become more robust, they become more inclusive, they become more debated, and that process of contestation, a political contestation about policies, then becomes, you know, a crucial part of the process. I think very often in these international processes where the assumption is, you know, science speaks to policy in that linear way that I've been criticizing, we don't get that political debate. And then right at the end, somebody says, oh, well, I disagree because, you know, the red line is drawn by government X or Y, because we haven't surfaced that political debate. Let's have it not as just a technical exercise. Let's have it as a political exercise and make that an inclusive one. And I think, you know, we do have some platforms, luckily, in the space that we're working on in food. Let's invest in those and not try and create parallel ones.
Good. Thank you. Agnes.
Thank you. There was a question on partnerships, public-private partnerships. Just to give an example, here I was particularly referring to there's this baby food factory that has been put in Rwanda. It's about $70 million worth investment done by a Dutch company in Rwanda, and to be able to make it successful, to be able even to get this company to invest in Rwanda. We had DEVCO, which is a bridge funding. We had IFC, World Food Programme, and even the government of Rwanda itself put in resources, right? So partners coming together, putting the resources to de-risk a business initiative that, I mean, if on its own wouldn't be able to do this, because profitability in some of these businesses take forever. And of course, as businesses, they're looking for profitability. So this is an initiative that is generating baby food and food for mothers to cater for the 1,000 days of a child in a country where malnutrition is a big deal. It's huge, but also in a region where it's huge. And actually this facility is now looking to expand into the region to just be able to deal with this problem. So these are some of the things. And for me, what I like most about it is that it actually purchases its raw materials from Africa. So from Rwanda, from smallholder farmers in Rwanda, making it possible for smallholder farmers to participate in a value chain that is extremely important to them. Which takes me then to the next question, whether short value chains would make sense. A while ago, I was in one of the European countries trying to talk about investments in Africa and how we can move investments in Africa. And this was versus migration and young people migrating to Europe to find jobs. So I was trying to tell people that if you don't bring the jobs to Africa, people will find the jobs where they are, right? Africa is exporting millions of jobs through its imports. So because as a result, what happens? People go to find jobs where jobs are being generated. So I was trying to tell them, but why don't you think about the reverse opportunity? The fact that there are raw materials on the continent of Africa that you can invest in. And actually, many times you're getting them from Africa, process them somewhere and take them back to Africa. So these raw materials are in Africa. There's labor. Today, we cannot talk about Africa not having skilled labor. I've seen situations in India where people are skilled in different things and they are retooled to respond to specific needs. So these kids these people that are crossing over oceans to come to other continents are doing so. These are some of our best, right? So these people are skilled. It's not like they have nothing to offer. They are skilled. They could be retooled to participate in any industry. So I think the opportunity for people to invest in these markets, because the markets are there, otherwise they wouldn't be having $1 billion. Right now we are talking about billions of dollars, about $50 billion of imports on this continent in food that we produce, perfectly capable of producing. So the only way we can make that work right now is if the investments are happening on this continent, right? And if businesses make their investments here, right now, businesses make investments in other places and really have the opportunity to drive down the cost and make very, very competitive products on the African market, mostly because many of them are subsidized. If we go to the true cost of food, these people will never be able to get food to the African continent. African farmers can't compete because nobody's subsidizing them. Anyway, long story short, this is not something that these countries can do overnight. There's a whole lot of, even if we wanted to reduce the length of value chains, there's a whole lot of preparatory process, that we would have to go through. But I think there's an opportunity now to build on the back of everything that is happening from a climate change perspective and the need to build shorter value chains, but also an equity perspective and the need to ensure that producers that are participating in the value chains have an opportunity to. But also businesses don't have to make extremely huge profits on the back of public resources and really make it look like they are actually making big profits. No, they are making big profits because they are subsidized. So anyway, the opportunity sits there. Whether African countries take it and really use it and invest in it is something else.
Thank you, Agnes. If you can bear with us, we have still lots of questions coming. So first I want to call on McCoy Cantwell, and then Gabriela Ferreira, and then there's an anonymous question from one of our students. So first, McCoy.
Hi there. Thanks for coming to do the talk. I'm an LSA student here. Just wondering, so dramatic increases in food prices and insecurity over the past 18 months, they parallel some of the patterns that we saw back around 2008, 2009, that, left millions starving today. And then obviously you had different processes going on. There was much more in the way of food speculation back more than a decade ago, and now the issues are largely caused by supply chain interruptions. But either way, the global integration for the food market has been behind these spikes in hunger. So where do the arguments for food sovereignty fit into the future of food systems?
Very good. Very good. Thank you, McCoy. Gabriela Ferreira? Is Gabriela there to ask the question?
Gabriela is having audio issues, so I'm going to read his questions for him.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Gabriela is asking, could you comment on successful advocacy cases that managed to influence government budget allocation to initiatives related to food security?
Okay, thank you. Successful advocacy cases. And then we have a third question from an LSE student. So let me read it. For Action Track 1, we focus on nutrition. Therefore, it is important to represent the diverse representations of malnutrition, including undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, hunger, and also obesity, diet-related diseases, and the like. I was in another debrief from this event, and someone raised the question, where were the hungry people and their voices in the food summit? On this note, my question is, how do we create pathways for participation of the poorest and most vulnerable members of the global population? How do we create game-changing solutions that reflect their realities? How do we ensure that our game-changing solutions are not out of reach of the poorest small-scale farmers? Please answer any of the questions you please. So there we go.
Interesting. Maybe the question on successful advocacy and how successful advocacy changes investments in food and food security in particular. I've tried to understand what drives, as I work on the African continent in AGRA, I try to understand how is it that we have a continental framework that allows us to invest in agriculture, or that encourages us to invest in agriculture. We call it CADAP, the CADAP framework, that requires us to do 10% or more, and we don't do it. So one of the things that I've seen that nudge people forward, there are two things that I've seen that nudge people forward. It's not advocacy. It's some form of agreed upon performance mechanism, if well tracked and if reported against, does nudge forward performance against some of these areas. You can see that when this type of information is presented in a forum where you've all agreed to deliver against something, first of all, the agreement must be there and the buy-in must be there. So once you've all agreed on this, the following up and saying, but this is not happening. What's going on? I've seen a few countries step forward and really make an effort. And in fact, while working in Rwanda, this is one thing I exploited a lot. And because I would tell my government that we committed 10% and we are not doing 10%. And once in every time I brought it up, my president would turn to the Minister of Finance and ask, how much are we doing? We committed to this, we said we'd do this, how much are we doing? And that always came in very handy for me because I knew that that is something that he would care about. So we've seen about 35 countries on the continent make an effort, move forward, make those type of investments. And it's always really something that if we are holding ourselves accountable, you will see more of that. The other thing that, again, I'm talking again from experience, the other thing that I saw is when it is associated with, when you're able to tell a country that you're going to impact two things, inflation and GDP. If you're able to tell a country that if we do this, and you've been able to track your inflation and you know when inflation happens, if you do this, we can manage your inflation. If you do this, it will contribute to GDP. These are some of the things that I find appealing to ministers of finance, and ministers of finance respond to because they want it to look good too. But to advocate, to say we have so many hungry people, whatever, sometimes it just doesn't fall on deaf ears. And it's not that they don't know. So, but I think that every time you have something, metrics you've agreed upon and you bring them forward, or you have some interesting business opportunity that really helps move things forward from a GDP perspective, from this, if we perform like, if we do this, it will improve our GDP understanding. Ministers of finance tend to listen to that, and that will advance. But there's also other things that do work. If the advocacy is within parliament, if you're able to get your voice to parliament and because parliamentarians approve budgets, and you get parliamentarians to push for the right initiatives, to push for the right things, governments listen too. So that's the place where I've seen linking advocacy from the population to the speakers, to the people that represent them, sometimes has impact too. So those are the three things that I've seen that seem to work. Now, on the question around getting the poorest to participate and not leaving them behind, I think really it's finding mechanisms and means of inclusion. Now, one thing I've come to learn, at least that I learned from the Food System Summit, it's extremely difficult to bring in, and COVID, of course, made it even more difficult. It's extremely difficult to bring in the poor, to bring in the far to reach. And why is that? Because we have the so-called representation. People come represented by other people, and you keep asking yourself, so are we really able to reach these people? How deep is this voice going? Yes, representation is acceptable until the right. That's how we've structured our society. But in the COVID times, it just feels inadequate because we are speaking across screens. We are representatives that are not able to make it to screens cannot be included. So I wish I had an answer to that, but I would love to see more inclusion and participation and voice. Just because people are poor doesn't mean they don't have ideas. Just because people live far doesn't mean they don't try to have ideas. And some of the best things that are happening in our society are coming from some of these communities. We made a huge effort to include, for example, indigenous communities, and they brought up some of the best ideas in the summit that we haven't had in a long time, and some of the most important commitments around how we can conserve our environments. So there's an opportunity right there, but we need to do more. The intention is very clear. There's a whole lot of people that want to do more inclusion, but I would also love to learn from you all how we can do it better.
Thank you. Ian, you probably want to respond to some of this, but let me take the next round of questions to make sure we give people the chance to put their things on the table, and then I'll come back to you afterwards. So first I have David Lewis, our colleague at the International Development Department here. Then Stuart Gillespie will read out his question from YouTube, and then Timothy Wise, who's on the YouTube call as well. So David first.
Thanks, James, and thank you, Agnes. You have me to blame, I think, for us bringing you here today, because it was us contacting you through our friend Joseph Mutaboba, who enabled us to get your contact details. So thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us. I wanted to go back down to the other end of the food system, to the farmer, the farmer level. And I was very interested in your comments on efforts to strengthen the livelihoods of small farmers in Rwanda. And you mentioned the bringing about of land consolidation, and you mentioned that it was quite controversial. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how it was achieved, how fragmented plots were brought together. And then I had a supplementary question on that, which is about the position of these small farm households, and whether you think very small farms will remain viable into the future, or are those households increasingly depending on income from non-farm sources?
Good.
Great, thank you, David. These are very important and classic question, really. Stuart Gillespie is asking from the YouTube audience, the presentation was about the UN Food Systems Summit and AGRA's experience in Rwanda, both driven by large corporates. What are the paradigm shifts? Okay. What are the paradigm shifts? And then from Timothy Wise from Tufts University, the question, as Ian Scoons says, the formula is not well known. In fact, AGRA has failed to increase productivity, incomes, and food security in 15 years. Where is the evidence that the approach is working? Okay, there we go.
Very good. Thank you so much. Let me start with the question of David on consolidation and what I consider was achieved and some of the controversies that I saw in there. Consolidation, first of all, is an idea that would only work in an environment where farmers own land like we did in Rwanda. So Rwandan farmers, we have 10-point-something million pieces of land for a population of about 13 million people today, 12 million people. So really highly fragmented, but also the beauty of that is we've put in place a mechanism where the land is owned by the farmer. It is actually on paper, in their name. So you could only do an idea of consolidation where farmers' rights are secured. So that was, for us, first of all, the first premise. The second is consolidation is not so much about the land. It's also about how you get volume, how you get scale in any appreciable way. And if you're going to have markets go to farmers, you need a certain form of scale. And in this case, Rwanda is very good. It's probably the world's, I've heard people say it's the world's highest diversity of sources of beans, which we do very well. So if you're going to produce beans and fortified beans as we have now, and have it at market scale, you need a significant number of farmers do the right thing. So consolidation was being able to have extension, go to these farmers in ways that would allow them to produce market quality stuff that actually can be marketed and allow them to have surplus. So there's no single formula. It's a whole lot of things coming together. So first of all, that worked in the sense, if you ask me from my perspective and from what Ian was saying, from a technology perspective, that worked. You get farmers good seed, you help them access extension, they get access to improved fertilizers, and these farmers actually improve yields. These farmers actually have something to sell. And these farmers, one was able to move from 1,700 calories as the daily available food, which is very low compared to what FAO recommends, to now 2,500 calories of food. So the science is there, the information is there, the evidence is there. This can be seen. But the complexity of doing that is not just the science, Ian, it is bringing the technology, but also bringing the institution and the policies together. So those are some, and in that there are controversies in the sense that people, one of the biggest things was like, oh no, you're forcing farmers to grow beans. They didn't plan to grow beans this season and you made them grow beans. Oh no, but there's nothing like forcing. Everything is about having that level of conversation at community level. And I can't tell you how many times I just spent sitting down with communities and having a conversation with them around what are we going to do next? What do we do next? And why? These people also care about their own development. They also understand what is in it for them, what you're saying and what is in it for them. So that's really what happened there. And I can go more into that, David, but I'll leave it there. In terms of whether the Food System Summit and the work at AGRA is driven by corporates, I mean, you can call it whatever you want, but in the Food System Summit, we had member states. I don't think 165 member states stepped forward because they are getting paid by corporates to step forward. We had indigenous people, they had a declaration. We had youth, they had a youth declaration. We had private sector did have their private sector declaration. And the Food System Summit was funded by member states. It was not funded by corporates. So the corporate capture thing is worth talking about, but really it is blown out of proportion when it comes to how the Food System Summit engaged, because the bottom line is our commitment was to engage people, was to engage nations, was to ensure there are dialogues of all sorts. And they did happen. Nobody can question that those things did happen. Corporate influence in the agricultural sector cannot be taken to mean corporate influence in the food system. So I think we need to separate these two, and it's really important that we do. In terms of corporate influence in AGRA, I mean, honestly, the truth is we get funding it comes from philanthropy. That's the simple truth. Does that translate into corporate influence? What I do on this continent and what my institution does on this continent is work for the African continent. Work for the African continent, work for the advancement of the African people. Right? It has nothing to do with what corporates out there are interested in. So I will leave it at that for now.
Okay.
In terms of there's another question from Timothy Wise, who I'm very happy to meet. He's been asking the same question over and over and over and over and over. The formula is not well known. We have failed to improve yields in Africa. But if I go by what Ian said, the formula is not just technologies. The formula is not just putting one technology to the other and then you get yields on farmers' fields. In fact, Timothy, even in Rwanda, where I had all the support I needed and where I was working at the farm level, in AGRA I don't want to work at the farm level, where I was at the farm level, we still saw in 2014, 2015, and today, we still see yields going down. There's something called climate change that is happening on farmers' fields, whether you like it or not. So the things that are happening with farmers in Africa, the deterioration of yield for a country that was for a continent that was on its way up is real and has nothing to do with AGRA. With or without AGRA, yields are going down. And AGRA works only across 11 countries. In the other countries, they are challenged as well. But let me be very clear around what AGRA does, so that even as you say these things, Timothy, you know exactly what AGRA does. AGRA works on strengthening systems. AGRA is not working in Rwanda. I can talk about how I improved farmers' yields because I worked with farmers. AGRA works on ensuring that African food systems can work. We work on seed systems. We work on, now we are struggling. I'm struggling to figure out what market systems would work for farmers, because I believe in the countries we are in, we've figured out how to make private sector participate in input systems that can actually enhance farmers' yields. Because farmers, once these services become available to farmers and affordably so, farmers can buy inputs and have increased yields. AGRA does not give out seeds, does not give out fertilizers. AGRA works on strengthening systems. And the results of that takes a while, and that's going to take a while to happen. But even if even within that context, there's still the challenge that we're talking about of climate change. In my work every day, the challenge I have right now is whether my farmers can access markets, whether my farmers can access, whether the SMEs work with can access finance in an environment that is completely being deteriorated by climate change. So factor in some of those things as to why yields in Africa are not increasing. AGRA's job is not deteriorating Africa's yields. AGRA is trying to make sure that we strengthen institutions in Africa so that what happens in the agricultural sector can get the chance of being sustainable. Agricultural systems in America, where you're calling from, are built on the back of land grant universities that built strong extension systems. They are not built on giving fertilizers to farmers and seeds and fertilizers to farmers. They are built on strong systems. That's what AGRA is trying to achieve on this continent. That's what we are trying to do. And we will be able to achieve it. Get institutions that can actually help deliver for smallholder farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. Ian, would you like to come back and respond to any of that before I give Agnes the kind of final word?
I mean, I can't respond to all of that, of course. I mean, I wanted to go actually back to a question that we didn't cover, which was asked about how supply chain disruption and speculation and the contrast between the food, particular moment of food crisis now and the previous one in 2008 and 9. And what that tells us about food systems more broadly. I think it does, and I think it was a very good question. I'm not sure it necessarily tells us that the direction is only food sovereignty, but it tells us a lot about the vulnerability of existing and indeed corporate controlled food systems. Because in the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, we saw a massive disruption of food systems. As the questioner said, this was largely due to speculation. That speculation resulted in land grabbing and all of that we saw across Africa, and an increasing consolidation of control over food in the subsequent period. Now we're seeing a different pattern of disruption emerging, in particular from the pandemic, which has disrupted global supply chains in particular ways. And I think what we can learn, one of the important things we can learn from the COVID experience is that, again, shorter supply chains, more localized food production systems, not necessarily separated from markets, by far from it. This isn't a sort of argument for autarky or whatever. This is an argument for more robust, more resilient, more localized, and therefore more climate-friendly food systems that may or may not echo a food sovereignty argument or an agroecology argument, but are very much founded on small-scale farmers who really do know how to grow food and market food successfully. And I think if you look at any of the success stories where small-scale farmers have produced more food We don't know the formula. No, we definitely don't know the formula, but it does involve technology. It does involve institutions. It does involve the social relations that constitute food systems, and those have to go together. And I think our current systems of supporting, whether in Africa or elsewhere, I mean, it could be said of European systems as well, our current ways of supporting small-scale agriculture to do well in a climate threatened world are just not up to the job. Those old systems that came out of the land-grant universities, which were mentioned before, don't necessarily deliver in the same way. We don't have a bunch of technologies on the shelf that will be the perfect solution that can be transferred through an extension system to farmers. We've got to have this much more participatory approach to technology development, much more participatory approach to market development. And I think that's the way, if we're thinking about a new paradigm that was asked before, that's where I would say the new paradigm lies. It's a paradigm that has been articulated over decades, to be frank, in debates about farmer participatory research and action. And, Robert Chambers is not here on this call, but he's been going on about this for quite a while, I would suggest. And I think him and others would argue that we, now particularly when we're confronted with the disruptions of COVID, the challenges of climate change, the difficulties of delivering food in a globalized system, we've got to go back to those fundamentals and rethink how we go about technology development. And I think that probably needs some rethinking in organizations like AGRA as well as we go forward. So that's where I will leave it.
Ian, thank you. During the COVID, we've seen the kinds of fragilities that are in our food systems. You just mentioned it, in Europe and North America, as well as across the developing world. And one of the things that really struck me is how we have noticed, and we notice it here now with Brexit, that our farm systems have come to depend on almost slave-like labor environments in the rich countries. And we were also so dependent on bringing temporary workers that, with COVID and with Brexit here, we're in a crisis in our agricultural system. But I noticed that also in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, where the cocoa mechanisms of production are dependent on very cheaply paid migrant labor, disrupted completely by the pandemic. So I think it is, we are at a moment, and I found Agnes's, much of what you said, Agnes, very inspirational in terms of trying to confront this new situation. So just before I thank you both, Agnes, maybe you want to have the last word. We always give the speaker the last word.
No, thank you so much, James. One of the things that when I was doing my PhD back there in Massachusetts, one of the things that I always thought about was that one day I will have a connection with being in a university and doing what I care about the most. Is being able to pass knowledge, really embed myself in acquiring knowledge, but also being able to pass knowledge. And here, this is not about passing knowledge, this is about sharing and also learning from you all, and any opportunity for us to learn from each other and to share, demystify some of the myths that are out there is extremely important, is a huge opportunity. But I also see this as an opportunity for you to tell you our story, our side of the story, from where we come from and how we do things, the things that we do and why we do them, the hopes and aspirations that we have, and some of the challenges that we live with. Even as much as we think we are connected, there's still some of those things that still are not clear to all of us. And again, it gives us an opportunity to learn from each other. So thank you for giving me the opportunity, but also to meet Ian, I would really love to follow up because I love your thinking from a policy perspective, from an institutional perspective. I'd love to follow up with you and see how we can use, just being able to have a smaller group debate with some of the people who are good thinkers here on this continent, and just having the opportunity to challenge each other, I think would be really good as a way of enhancing knowledge between us and moving some of the things we care about forward. One of the things we think about a lot here on this African continent is what will it take to transform African agriculture? We know that 7 out of 10 people, if you look at it from a food system perspective, live in agriculture in Africa, but it continues to elude us. It continues to be the most elusive thing we all work in, and yet the most elusive thing, again, given the challenges, but also the complexity of the problem that we are trying to deal with. So I would really love an opportunity to have, to have a follow-up conversation on some of the ideas you had and how we can strengthen working. And thank you, David, for getting me to this conversation and really giving me an opportunity to talk to this audience. And thank you, James, for being such a great and fantastic host.
Agnes, thanks so much. I mean, and I'm speaking on behalf of all the LSE students and faculty who are here, and all the people who are listening in and watching from YouTube. This was a fascinating evening. Ian, I think there's a great invitation to pursue the conversation and engagement. And, staying up so late to talk to us, we really appreciate it. And we hope we'll have you back to the LSE sometime soon. So everybody we're having lots of thanks coming in through the chat. So thank you very much. And I